These slides are nice because Stephanie created them.
I'm like, what sort of metaphorical images can we include?
That works.
All
The
right.
future is cloudy.
All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us in person and on Zoom. Hello, Michael. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you.
Excellent. How is everybody in the room? How are you, Paul?
Good, good.
Great. Jessica, you're doing well?
I'm doing well.
Yeah. John still has a voice from his concert yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
So what we're going to do is spend some time talking about our general takeaways from the IITG grant that is just wrapping up now. This is a project that we worked on pretty much for the whole last year. John and I worked on it together with some other campuses, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And on each of our campuses, we called it the AI Fellows Program. So you will hear me referring to it that way, but it is talking about the grant and what we did, what we accomplished, and then some of our next steps as well. So here we go. If you would like a copy of these slides, then you could take a moment and scan the dinosaur. But this presentation is also being recorded and it will be available at some point in the future.
Today.
It will be available today. All right, so this is the group of people who helped sort of lead this initiative. So this was our leadership team. Our PI, or principal investigator, is Rachel Fest, and she's from SUNY Oneonta. So she kind of gathered us all together and, helped us stay organized. And then we also had collaborators from SUNY Alfred, SUNY Orange. John and I both participated from SUNY Oswego, and that was helpful for a few reasons, which I'll talk about later, to have two of us. Then we had participation from SUNY Morrisville and also SUNY Schenectady. So this was very much a collaborative effort among these different campuses as we were working together to lead our different cohorts of participants on each of our campuses. So I'll talk more about what that looked like in just a minute. But I did think it was helpful to kind of show all of the varied participation in this project, which, we thought was really promising. So I picked a picture of a snowy cabin because when we started this project with all of our different cohorts on our campuses, it was January, and our day that we really began, there was like this horrible snowstorm. So it felt really fitting to kind of just stick with that. So the big goal of this project was for our participants to design or redesign a learning activity or an assignment that met our three criteria, to design an assignment that was critical, active, and inclusive. And again, they didn't have to start from scratch if they didn't want to. They had the option of sort of looking at an assignment or activity that they were already doing in their courses and thinking about how they might adopt that assignment or what changes they might need to make to that assignment now that AI is doing what AI does, right? So what we mean by critical is we wanted our participants to design an assignment or activity that encouraged their students to critically evaluate an AI tool or an AI tool's output. So we really wanted this group experience to sort of focus on good practices when we're thinking about looking at AI and building AI literacy skills. So to help teach our students to not just blindly accept the output of what they receive when they engage with AI. So the critical piece was probably the most important because we really wanted our participants to focus on that critical evaluation and to think about information literacy in that way. And we have several examples of how our participants sort of tackled that piece of the criteria. The second thing that we wanted our participants to do was design an activity or an assignment that was active, which basically means we wanted their students to actively engage with an AI tool of their choice. So they had to do stuff with it, right? Like they couldn't just assume what ChatGPT would do or what Claude would do or Copilot or whatever. They had to actually do things with the tool, and that was part of their evaluation process and really connected to that critical piece. And the last major criteria that we wanted them to follow was to design an activity or an assignment that was inclusive. So we wanted them to think about inclusivity in a few different ways. The first thing that we wanted to think about was sort of like who has access to this tool. So like, is it a good idea, for example, to require your students to use the paid version of something, right? Is it important to consider who might have access to a paid version and who does not? And then also when we're thinking about inclusivity, we decided to take this a step further and really incorporate the TILT framework into this program. So as we were talking to our participants and encouraging them to design assignments, we encouraged them to follow the TILT framework so that they could make the purpose and the task and the criteria of their activity very, very clear for their students, so that their students would have a lot more guidance than they perhaps would without the TILT framework. So those were the three biggest pieces of this that we were focusing on. We did focus on some other areas too, but I'll talk more about those as we sort of keep going. Does anybody on Zoom have any questions so far about the learning activity or assignments that participants were designing and the criteria that they had to follow? Does everybody feel good?
Was there a certain kind of AI program that was sort of the basis of the critical activity, like what a particular version that we were being that they were encouraged to be critical of or try to take a look at?
So by program, you mean like which kind of like platform, like ChatGPT?
Yeah, which one?
Something?
ChatGPT, OpenAI, which one exactly?
That was left open. The basic goal was for the faculty to choose whatever tool might be most appropriate, and when possible, leave students some autonomy and some choice in that. But the main thing was we wanted people to use a free version so that students didn't have to pay extra. And the purpose of the critical component was just so that they would not take the output at face value, recognizing that hallucinations happen and such things.
Yep. So for different, depending on, and I mean, we had participants from a whole bunch of different disciplines, a whole bunch of different areas. So depending really on where they were coming from, that sort of determined which tool they were more attracted to. We did have a lot of participants use ChatGPT because of, its capabilities and, the free version and all of those sorts of things. But we did have participants experimenting with other tools as well. That's a good question. Okay. All right. So I'm going to show you some samples of learning activities or assignments that came from our campus. I have 2 samples here, and then we can look at some more later on if we have time. So the thing that I want to be clear about is that this example that you see on the board is just a piece of the whole assignment. It's not the whole thing. Many of our participants designed really like robust assignments that had a lot of different pieces and parts. So if anyone was at Genevieve's presentation yesterday, she walked us through what she did because she participated in this project as well. And she created a really, really cool economics project that had students sort of look at like what an AI tool would, produce versus like what doing the math by hand would produce, and then sort of like comparing and contrasting those 2 results. So if you want, her presentation was really excellent. So you can check out her recording, which should be available online soon.
In a while, because that one has to be edited manually.
Okay.
Because there's 2 sessions.
Because there's 2.
One. Yeah.
Okay. So that one will be online like in the near future.
Tonight, sometime.
Tonight. So anyway, so this is a section of our colleague Gonzalo's assignment. So if you don't know Gonzalo, he's really wonderful. He works in modern languages and literatures. And he had decided to think about an activity that he does in class, which is structured like a debate. So this activity has several different pieces, but basically what he's asking his students to do is they watch a film called Alma Punk, and then the class is divided into groups and they are assigned to debate different themes or like things that are sort of coming up in the film. So what he has them do, in addition to like help them prepare for this debate, is in addition to doing their own research and looking up their own debate points, he also has them use AI to sort of like help prepare for this debate. And then at the end of the debate, after it's all said and done, he asks them to kind of reflectively answer the following 5 questions. So he wants them to think about, you know, how they used ChatGPT in this instance to construct their argument for the debate. And then what sorts of prompts did you find most effective for generating nuanced responses from the AI? So this is a really excellent example of a good critical question. He's asking his students to think about how they prompted the AI tool and then what happened as a result of that. Then he asks them, in what ways did you notice any bias? And then I think this question is really wonderful because he's encouraging students to think about not only their own assumptions, but also what's happening with ChatGPT's responses. So to look at that potential bias and then to really evaluate it and think about why that matters. Then how could these biases have influenced your portrayal or interpretation of Alma's character or the punk subculture? And then what would you do differently in your future prompting strategies to think about bias or enhance the depth of your analysis? So he's asking just 5 questions, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's happening here. And he's really encouraging students to not only think about how they're prompting the AI tool, but then to also consider its output and then how that output may be affecting their own sort of thoughts and opinions about Alma Punk and like what this means in the context of his course. So I really liked this example. Okay. The next one, this again is just a small excerpt from the larger project, but this is from our colleague Bella, who is from the theater department. And she's looking at AI and how it can sort of like help her creative writing students brainstorm in various ways. So I thought that this was really funny and like a nice contrast to what we were just looking at with Gonzalo's. So basically, she wanted her students to prompt the AI tool, give me an outline for the worst play idea you can think of. Then she wants her students to read the idea and take a couple of basic plot points from it, and then create their own scene using the most interesting ideas that are generated. So this is something that I'll do in my own classes sometimes as well. I think there's a lot of value in looking at really horrible things, right? Like really horribly written things, for example, if you're doing writing. And because they know that like a human didn't create this, they're going to have more opportunities to rip it apart, you know? But then also thinking about, okay, like, is there anything that we can pull out of this? Is there anything that we can learn from this? Or is bad just bad? So this was another example of a piece of her larger assignment. Definitely ask students to actively engage with AI, inclusively engage with AI, and then the critical piece comes a little bit later on in her assignment. So she has them do a whole bunch of prompts where they just experiment with the AI tool for things like the whole idea. She also has them prompt AI to help with character development, to help with things like setting, to help with dialogue. So Bella had a whole bunch of different exercises that were just tailored to the different pieces that go into writing a play. And then, you know, like she has her students interact with AI like beyond that as well.
I'm curious to know what AI considers worst.
Right. That's a
What,
great.
how
What criteria? What is the rubric?
yeah,
Yes.
what is bad?
Mm-hmm.
With no definition of that. It just
Yeah.
It would have access to lots of reviews though.
Mhm.
So it would be interesting.
What was did she share the outcome of what the students, how they engaged with this, what their thought process was after? Because often we think about kind of, you know, flips it, right? The worst idea or the most boring idea. That's not typically what I have the students do. So it's a good idea to kind of make them critically think. So I think this is good. So I'm wondering what they had as an outcome.
Not, we don't know many of the outcomes just yet
Okay.
because most of these assignments were designed this semester, and the idea is that they'll be implemented in the fall.
In the fall, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
So
This will be interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Is that for theater 110 or for?
This one was for I think a 300 level theater class. If that does that sound right, John? I think it was
I
a
think so.
300 level. Yeah.
I guess from the students' expertise, that worst part, they'll be able to
Yeah.
play around with and see, well, yeah, or yeah.
They'll have a little bit more refinement.
Yeah.
In their understanding of what worse is.
Yeah.
Well, and that will be, and I mean, I haven't experimented with AI in this way yet to see if it really will give you something bad, you
Right.
know, because it tends to not to want to do that
Mm.
on purpose.
Yeah.
All right, so now that we've seen a couple of examples, so sort of our general overall project objectives. So something that I didn't talk about yet, hi Maggie, was in addition to creating and designing a learning assignment or activity, we also encouraged, and actually not just encouraged, we required our faculty participants to create and include AI policy statements for their syllabi. And you know, this is really important, you know, it helps guide students sort of to navigate what is happening with AI in their different courses. It's also good to have something to refer back to. So we did encourage faculty to do that as well. Our other project objective was to, you know, like help support the AI literacy component that is going to be talking about this more later on today, but we're thinking about information literacy and how we can encourage our students to work to understand what it means to take information from different sources, right? So this project was meant to help support that as well. And then we also across the SUNY system. So I'll talk more about, I think, pretty much all of these things as we keep going. John, I just got a note on this computer that the internet connection is unstable.
Oh.
Thank you, CTS.
Can everybody on Zoom still see our screen okay?
Yeah.
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 Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. All right, so sort of like a big picture thing. So as I mentioned earlier, we had 6 different SUNY campuses all participating in this project. We had a total of about 65 participants from those campuses. It's worth mentioning that Oswego had the largest group of participants. So we had 24 of the 65. So that was made possible by some extra funding from CTS. So thank you, Sean, for helping to support us. Initially, the plan was for every campus to have 10 participants. We had funding from the IITG for 10 participants per campus. Some of our campuses were not able to get 10 participants, and then others were able to scale it up. So Oswego and Oneonta both scaled up because we were able to secure some extra funding. All of
We
our
had at least 10 more than on the answer. So.
Yes, we had a lot, yeah, and which was, and I mentioned earlier that was one of the reasons why it was really nice for John and I to be able to work on this project, because we had a significantly larger size cohort than everybody else. So we were able to really divide and conquer a lot of the work, which was very helpful. Our participants also, upon completion of this program, received a $600 stipend. So, you know, it's not much, but it's better than, you know, than doing it for nothing. And that was made possible by the IITG, which was really great. We really wanted to be able to provide some kind of compensation to our participants, you know, to recognize that this is work, to think about redesigning assignments or activities, and to think about AI and what AI is doing in higher education. So we wanted to try to compensate in some way. I mentioned that John and I have been working on this project for about a year with our other participating campuses. So basically what we did is John and I and the other members of the leadership team met last summer to kind of get started and start planning this whole thing. And then in Oneonta. And then we planned and planned and planned and planned for
Every other week.
for the whole fall semester. You know, we met bi-weekly with the other members of the team to kind of like figure this out. And then in January, this past January, that's when everything kind of like kicked off on all of our campuses. So we started by inviting Anna Mills, who is a writing teacher and kind of turning into a pretty big name in the world of AI literacy. She works at the College of Marin, and she came and spoke to our cohorts virtually in January before we really kicked off the whole thing.
It was extremely well attended.
It was.
In fact, we were at the capacity of the Zoom room.
Yeah.
And people who were trying to get in had to wait until someone got disconnected.
It was in addition to making this talk available, you know, like for just our cohorts, the SUNY CPD was able to promote it for us as well, which is why we had such incredibly high attendance. What was the cap, John? Like 300?
300.
Yeah, 300 or so.
And
yeah.
we were always at 298 to 300 throughout the whole thing.
Yeah. But she gave a really wonderful talk and encouraged us to sort of be thinking about AI in our teaching and in several different ways. So it was a nice way to sort of start everything out with that virtual talk with Anna Mills. And then after we had her talk, we each had a separate kickoff event on each of our campuses. So this was a full day in-person kickoff event. Like I said, at Oswego that day, we had a horrible snowstorm, so that was fun.
But most people made it anyway.
Most people made it.
Join us online.
Yep. Yeah. So John and I were like, okay, the weather's horrible. If you have to come over Zoom, then it's okay. And at our kickoff, we basically spent the day, you know, sort of like thinking about AI in all of the different ways, you know, and we had a really wonderful collection of perspectives on that first day.
And we had people from every campus, and we had a wide variety of disciplines. And one of the things that was really interesting is people started talking a little bit about their concerns and what they wanted to do. And some of the people started the day by saying they were mostly concerned with how they can prevent students from using AI for academic integrity violations. And by the end of the day, they were seeing that it could be useful in lots of ways themselves, as well as perhaps in learning, because we have people play with it. It started off by having them do some work with their courses, or do it for some curriculum development or curriculum analysis or revision. And then we had them play with some other things where they were doing something in terms of personal productivity or coming up with ways in which it could be used as assignments. And it was remarkable seeing how quickly the responsive faculty changed once they tried AI, sometimes for the first time. And we had a wide range of experience. Some people have been working with AI since it was first available, and others were just really getting into it that day.
Yeah, I agree. It was really fun to hear the different perspectives. And, you know, for some of our participants who had never used AI before, you know, they would, you know, just engage with ChatGPT and realize that ChatGPT was capable of answering questions that they would typically assign as test questions in their courses, right?
In fact, that was one of the activities we had.
Yeah. So that was interesting, right? Like learning what the capabilities of these tools really are, and, you know, how they are really going to affect us in those ways. Peter, I absolutely hate to put you on the spot, but since you're on Zoom and you were there, do you want to add anything?
No, it was just nice to speak with colleagues about these issues. I mean, I think we're all thinking about them as we're trying to figure out how we want to make things work going forward. And so it's just helpful to be able to talk with other people and hear their views and kind of get a sense for what they're doing, and taking a look at some models and samples of possibilities so you can kind of explore how you want to incorporate generative AI tools into your own course or not, and making that very clear for students.
Thank you, Peter. So after we had our kickoff, we sort of spent time with our groups on our campuses talking about how things were going to be set up and how they would run over the course of the semester. So we did have monthly meetings on each of our campuses. So at Oswego, because our group was so big, we divided our monthly meetings into two different groups. So we had basically two meetings, but our participants only had to come to one of them. In addition to meeting monthly in person or, at Oswego, we also designed what we called cross-campus groups. And the purpose of these groups was to facilitate conversation from one campus to the other. So one of the things that we had our participants do very early on in the grant process was we asked them if they would like to communicate with other folks who were in their same discipline, or if they would like to be in a cross-campus group with folks from other campuses who were from different disciplines. So depending on their preferences, we broke all of our 65 participants up into small groups. Most of the small groups had 3 or 4 participants in them. And they were charged with meeting 2 times over the semester. And the whole purpose of this was to just get them talking to each other, talk about what sort of class are you teaching? What are you thinking about in regard to AI right now? What sort of challenges are happening in your classroom at the moment? What kind of learning activity would you like to design? And what was interesting about these groups is that many of our participants, like we offered some guidance, but we tried to keep it very open. Many of our participants used them to workshop the materials that they were working to create for the project. So, in the first cross-campus group meeting, many of those groups used that opportunity to sort of workshop their syllabus statements together. I think most people kind of started with that syllabus statement because it was a little bit easier, so they would workshop their syllabus statements with one another and then chat about general things that were happening. And then in their second cross-campus group meeting, they would workshop their assignments with each other and sort of get some feedback in those ways. So we got mixed feedback on the cross-campus groups and how effective they were, how much people liked them or didn't like them. But that was another component of the project that was a required piece. And then the last thing, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is creating a public repository so that we can share the work that was created. And I want to mention that all of the things that are up here, going to the talk with Anna Mills, coming to the January kickoff, attending our monthly meetings, all of those criteria were tracked on a spreadsheet so that we could say at the end of the thing, yes, good job, you did all the things, here's your stipend. Okay, how are we doing? We're doing okay. So as John and I mentioned earlier, we did meet bi-weekly to figure out our lives. So that started in the summer and we're still meeting bi-weekly. I think we're never going to stop meeting bi-weekly Thursday mornings at 10 a.m. So there was so much planning that went into this, but I think that was part of the reason that it ran relatively smoothly.
Yes. And Rachel was great at organizing, and Stephanie did a tremendous amount of work putting together all the cross-campus groups and so forth, and matching people up to the extent possible when they wanted to work with people in similar disciplines or when they preferred working in different disciplines.
Rachel and I are both very type A, so we worked together very nicely in that way. So we had these bi-weekly meetings and they were very, very helpful for planning and implementation. We also created a Brightspace shell that I would be happy to show everybody if we have time at the end, which is basically how we kept everything organized. So we wanted this to run sort of like a course, but not like a course, but we needed a place where we could collect all of our information. So we created a Brightspace shell. All of our participants are in the shell as students, and then we are all, the teachers in the shell. And basically what we did was we divided it up into modules, just like you would during a regular semester. We made all of our monthly meeting materials available there. We put all of the guidelines there, all of the checklists that people needed to do. We linked the rubric there, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that's also where we had all of our participants submit all of their stuff. So it was really nice to have this collected kind of public shared space where we could work together. We had discussion boards in there that people would participate in. And it was good to just have everything in that one area. We also used a rubric that we created to help guide the submissions. So I will click on this. Oops, just kidding. So I know it's a little bit small, so I'm sorry about that. But this is the rubric that we created as a team and then shared with all of our participants. So we wanted something that would kind of guide everybody to help them create their final materials. So we looked at a few different things. We wanted our participants to add an AI policy to their syllabi. We also wanted our participants to identify one of their course learning objectives. So this was kind of like a two-step process. Some courses, you have the autonomy to manipulate your learning objectives, and some courses you don't, right? So in the courses where there was some flexibility, we encouraged the instructors to either add on to one of their existing learning objectives or create a new one that was specifically connected to AI. If you're teaching a course like English 102, for example, right, which is a class that I teach, I don't have that flexibility in the learning objectives. So instead of manipulating my course learning objectives, I would create a learning objective for the assignment that I'm giving my students, right, that has that AI component. So we wanted our participants to be thinking about what the learning objective is and then how their assignment would sort of line up with that learning objective. Give me 1 minute because something came through in the chat. Okay, yep, cool. So that was one piece. And basically we were just looking at our participants to like, okay, like, did you submit a syllabus with your materials or not? Then we were looking for our participants to create that AI learning activity or assignment. And it had to be critical, it had to be active, and it had to be inclusive. So we were looking at that. And then we also wanted our participants to be thinking about how they were going to evaluate this assignment or learning activity. So we spent a lot of time talking about feedback and all of the different ways that our participants could consider giving feedback. So, you know, for some, a grade is feedback, right? For others, you know, peer review is a form of feedback, or a workshop in class. Written feedback from an instructor, right? Or a rubric of their own would be a version of feedback. So we spent one of our monthly meetings talking about the difference between formative and summative feedback, and also giving some examples of how our participants could give feedback to their students on this activity.
And we encouraged everyone to provide formative feedback that would allow students to respond to the feedback, which didn't always happen, but we did get that in pretty much all the cases by the end.
And I mean, one of the other things that came up as well as we were talking about feedback, which I thought was very timely, was, you know, the question kind of came up, well, can we use AI to give feedback to our students? So that created a really productive, I think, conversation about, you know, sort of the things to be careful of, you know, in that way. And then we also shared a resource with our group by Leon Furs, who has written a lot about AI and, you know, and ethics, yeah, AI and ethics, that basically says, you know, like, don't use AI to give feedback to your students.
But you can encourage students to do it with the appropriate caveats that anything they upload becomes part of the training database unless you have something that's institutionally defined.
Yep. So this was the rubric that we used to sort of guide everybody through the process. We talked about this a lot. Okay. And then as we sort of started to get to the end, we had all of our participants submit their materials, I think on May 5th. Does that sound right, John?
It was right before finals.
Yeah.
Finals. It was, yeah.
It was
a busy time.
It was early in May when everybody was super stressed out. So we were like, submit your stuff now.
Which seemed like a great idea in October and November.
Yeah, it always does. So anyway, we had all of our participants submit their materials and we reviewed their materials in a peer review process. So basically everybody on the leadership team reviewed not their own participants' stuff, and then we went through and reviewed our own people's stuff again to make sure that we agreed that, like, yes, this is a good submission, it meets all of the criteria, or no, this submission still needs to be revised or revisited.
And the nice thing is, we didn't have to do all the comments about the faculty here. We could summarize what other people had said, because that way it wasn't us critiquing it. But
Yep. It was quite a it was a very collaborative process, we thought. So if our participants needed to revise, then we gave them, I think, until like tomorrow to do that, or maybe today. And then we'll go,
whatever it was.
and then we'll go back in, we'll, give them some more brief feedback about, like their revision process, and then we can move on. But we are very close to wrapping up this grant. Okay, so one of the things that we pulled out of this or created from this was a public repository that's called SUNY ACE. This is something that was created for us out of SUNY Oneonta, but it's basically where we're going to be putting all of these activities. So it is an OER repository. And the cool thing about this repository is that our projects are going to go there, but then there are also projects from a different IITG that created K through 12 learning activities, which are also going to be in this same space. So it is just kind of getting started at the moment.
And it's going to be WordPress. EdBeck is hosting it there.
Yeah.
And it was part of the Reclaim hosting project that we had a SUNY IITG grant a few years back, where all of the schools, except for Oswego, are still continuing to participate.
Thank you, John. It's yeah, still in beta testing, so I don't know if this is going to work.
It's a little slow. There we go.
Okay. So basically what you can do is, so we're going to have our participants, after they kind of get like the, yes, your project meets all of our criteria, we are going to have them submit their learning activity or assignment to this repository so we can sort of showcase it. And then I don't know how much is in here right now. So let's go.
Just a few.
Yeah.
And they were put up mostly as proof of concept.
So you can kind of just go in here and look and see, and then you should just be able to, click on it and then see more of the stuff. Yep. So this is what it looks like. It's still a little bit clunky right now, but it will continue to be refined. And we're hoping to have this ready to go by the end of June. All right. So some of our big takeaways from this is that I personally found this to be a really rewarding and productive experience, especially as there's still so much uncertainty about AI in our classrooms with our students and among our colleagues too. And I think, Paul and I were just talking about this yesterday, actually, that, we don't have definitive answers to any of these things, but having the conversations are really valuable, right? So that was probably one of my biggest takeaways. It was just really nice being in an area with others where we were all learning, right, about what we might do,
And as Peter said, that collaboration part was really important. That even with that all-day event, people were talking with the people around them, coming up with ideas, sharing ideas, and testing things.
That all-day event was probably my favorite part of this whole thing. Just being around everybody, right, and feeling the energy in the room, and asking questions and experimenting. So the critical, active, and inclusive pedagogy was also that was another win, I think, for this, especially as we were first getting started. Many of our participants were sort of like, okay, like, you're not going to ask me to like embrace AI, right? Like by the end of this. And we were like, well, no, we just want you to think about it, right? Like we want you to think about what's happening in your courses, right? And what we're maybe going to do about it as teachers. And then, like I mentioned earlier, helping to respond to that emerging AI literacy general ed guideline that's going to be forthcoming from SUNY 2026. Does that sound right? It was really nice hearing a whole bunch of different perspectives on AI. So as John mentioned, you know, early on, we had people who had never used it before. We had people who had used it quite a bit. We had people who were total skeptics. We were people who didn't want anything to do with it. And we had people who had embraced it. And even among the leadership team, you know, we had really varied perspectives, you know, which I think is healthy and important and productive. We mentioned that the organization and the collaboration was really important, and I'll say it again just because it really was. It was a lot of planning, but I think that if we hadn't done that, it would not have gone as well as it did. So, you know, for anybody who might want to embark on a project like this, organization is key. And then we will make changes with our participant feedback. So we had all of our participants take a pre and a post survey so that we could collect their feedback. And some of the things that I mentioned before that people were sort of most torn about were the cross-campus groups. And there were a few different reasons I think that people were torn about those. Some of the feedback that we got was, you know, the people who wanted to be in groups with participants from different disciplines had a harder time kind of making those connections because they were very different, versus like people who were in groups with similar disciplined participants, then that went a little bit more smoothly. But one of the things for us to think about as far as making changes with participant feedback is that we found out last week that the IITG that we submitted for this year was accepted. So we will be redoing a version of this project in this upcoming year, which will be structured quite a bit differently from how this one was. But this project that we did is, yeah, thanks, Peter. This project that we just kind of finished talking about will be running again. So like if any of you like are, you know, thinking that this could be a worthwhile thing, or you want to start thinking about how you might be able to make changes to your course or your assignments, then this component of what we just did this year is going to be repeated again in a slightly different way, along with 4 other more specialized, I'll call them courses, you know, or programs, right, that kind of talk about AI and teaching and learning. And that's it.
So any questions or comments?
Were there any math professors who took part in this project?
Yes.
On our campus?
Yes. Yeah.
Nice.
Can I don't know.
Sure.
Can we say who it
Yeah.
was? Zoe did.
I was gonna say probably somebody.
Because I noticed that, yeah, because I sat in on her presentation yesterday during the lightning round of her implementation, but I noticed that there were no contributions to the OER repository about classified under mathematics. Did Zoe not submit her work in that OER resources page?
Well, those are separate things. The OER repository, the OER is just open educational resources, and there's a lot of those out there.
But probably not yet. So like what we went through and we like left all of the feedback for all of our participants, and then we wanted to wait until everybody had the opportunity to revise, and then we're going to tell them about next steps and submitting to that public SUNY ACE repository that I just showed you. So there's very little in there from us at this time because we're waiting for the rest of our kind of like revision process to go through. But you should see it in there by the end of June.
And was mathematics a fairly popular choice among the participants, or was it kind of rare to get a math participant in this?
There's a lot of disciplines out there. So I don't think there were too many. There were a few people in STEM fields, you know, but a lot of people in humanities, a lot of people in social sciences, you know.
And education
and
too.
Education.
Yeah. I can't remember the numbers of how many
Yeah.
math participants we had, but I know that I think there were just a small handful.
And why do you think that STEM is so rare?
I don't know. I mean, I don't come from a STEM background, so I can't say,
A
I
lot
can
of
only
it is we see
speculate.
less professional development taking place in STEM fields in general, and that's a nationwide phenomenon that people have been concerned about for quite some time.
And we see it here too in our
In general,
in
yeah.
general. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions or comments before we wrap up? Cool. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And John and I have like a whole bunch more workshops today, so
Yes.
maybe we'll see you later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hang on. Good Lord.
Stop
Stop share.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and stop the. recording.
Yep, I'm gonna do that
Right up at the top.
right up at the top.
here.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got the workshop.